What I want to do is go through this Kaka'ako presentation. I think this is really critical to this class for sort of two reasons. One is I think it makes a sort of, tidy summary of a lot of the changes that we've looked at, especially in a Hawaii context, but I think also globally, but especially sort of American value changes as it's played out in this particular spot on the island of Oahu. But I think it also is handy because when you're looking at especially interiors, it's always important to remember that interiors are part of a larger social dynamic, as we've seen all semester long. And Kaka'ako is one of those really interesting puzzles when you look at current presentations for the various high rises that are going up that Hughes, Kamehameha Schools, A and B, and all the other folks are coming up with, how they're imaging those interiors, how they're imaging the places, and how they're trying to, I would point out very successfully, convert those to sales. So looking at Kaka'ako, I think is really interesting because, among other things, it's one of the few examples I can think of in Hawaii that you actually are forcing people to make a change in their mindset in terms of options and opportunities. And I would point out this is very much in contrast to what we see in, say, Ewa Kapolei, which would be very much sort of an expansion of the traditional American Southern California suburb. Which, of course, from an environmental standpoint, makes absolutely no sense on a small island. So Kaka'ako is sort of like the alternative. So if you want to think of it in a really condensed way, you can have something like Kaka'ako, or you can sort of like Hong Kong or urban Japan, or you can have suburban Los Angeles, which would be, the west end of the island. And these are your two options. And the fact that the state is doing both simultaneously is a huge disservice, both environmentally and also socially. That's a whole other issue. So that's very quickly. I'm going to tear through this. I'm not going to go through all the panels. The PowerPoint actually is fairly well self-explanatory and goes through a lot of the history. I just want to sort of illustrate several aspects. And one of these is just the absolutely stunningly dramatic change that you see in Kaka'ako. I should point out this is not unique to Kaka'ako. It's just Kaka'ako in some ways has sort of become the fast-tracked, accelerated version of what's going on for much of urban Honolulu as we speak. So Kaka'ako, in the pre-contact period, is basically saltwater flats. There's a number of fish ponds, or a number of drainages that come out through Kaka'ako. So Kaka'ako basically served as a series of fish ponds, streams, wet field systems to feed the population of basically this side of the island of Oahu. It's sort of a miniature version of what you see in a much more extensive way at Pearl Locks, or for example, also in Waititi, which is a much larger but very similar system. Kaka'ako is nothing but basically alluvial plain mud flats drained off of the streams that come down through Manoa and to a certain extent Nuuanu. And so the Hawaiians take advantage of this, intensively modify the area in the 1600s. So you have a very, very specialized agricultural system, largely based on aquaculture, taking place in Kaka'ako. The Malka portion, basically what would be now King Street and Malka, all the way through what's now Punch Bowl, would be basically in field systems, agricultural systems. So agricultural systems, Malka, aquacultural systems, Makai. And it's important to remember that the shoreline basically was now along what's now Kapiolani Boulevard. So the shoreline, including much of Honolulu Harbor, Queen Street, for example, which was originally the shoreline in Honolulu Harbor. So what you see now, you can't visualize as Kaka'ako. The whole Kaka'ako Park area, of course, is originally the city dump in the late 19th, early 20th century, but then it's covered over in landscape recently. So Kaka'ako pre-Western period is basically a part of the feeding population system that you see. By the early 19th century, by the 1830s, 1840s, what you see is the population both decreases and also shifts to basically cash crops. So your population consuming traditional food items starts to shrink radically, though less so in Honolulu than the other islands. Complications arise in terms of who should work for what and why, because you have the shift sort of to a cash economy, but it stutters and stops. The fish ponds especially are very labor intensive to build. They're not labor intensive to keep running, but you have to keep on top of them. And so what happens is the political control, as the Kamehamehas, for example, take over the island of Oahu, they don't really institute the same level of political micro control that the Oahu High Chiefs had. And so what happens is a lot of stuff sort of falls through the cracks, and you start to get very sort of opportunistic money, shots coming from the Kamehameha family and their entourage, especially here on Oahu. And so what happens is by the 1830s, 1840s, a lot of the fish ponds on this side of the island, both Waititi and Kaka'ako, have basically collapsed, not because there isn't a need for them, but because basically the level of sophisticated oversight that you go out and you clean the rocks every couple of months so that the algae will grow properly, that you make sure the makaha are working right so the drainage system works right. Fish ponds are very complicated systems. They're especially here in Hawaii, which are most complicated in the world. And so the fish ponds are sort of like a modern version, it'd be like a giant aquarium. And so as long as you have it running right, it runs fantastic. But the minute you start to lose track, then the whole thing falls apart very quickly. By the 1840s, the fish ponds are out of use. The agricultural system is starting to collapse. Again, it's fairly labor intensive, but again, you have to have levels of oversight. Who gets the water today? Who gets the water this month? Who cleans the drainage systems? And as that starts to fall apart, then the whole system, the infrastructure just collapses. By the 1840s, town ends at what's now Straub, but basically the Eva side of Ward Avenue is the end of town. That's why when they put in Thomas Square to celebrate the reinstitution of the monarchy, they put it in where Thomas Square is now, because that's beyond the end of town. So it's just empty land. So Honolulu basically entirely shrinks to the area around what's now Bishop Street, to a certain extent Lower Kalihi and New Wanu. But this side of the island basically just sort of becomes empty space. Let's very quickly take a look at that. Okay, here's the area of Kaka'ako, basically where it's sort of Ward Avenue looking Makai, sort of towards Waikiki. Waititi's over this side. And here's what the system looked like. This is your intensive wet field systems. Sort of hard to see, but in front of the trees here, this would all be basically fish ponds. And again, it's just like rice fields that you see in Asia today. It's very hard physical labor. There's a tremendous reward in terms of the amount of food you get per square meter. So it's labor intensive, but it's also very production intensive in terms of the amount of food you get. But as the population starts to shift to cash paying jobs, to shift to downtown and such, it's hard, just like we're seeing today, it's hard to find people to do grunt jobs if there's other alternatives. And so what happens, these start to basically be abandoned because there just isn't the population that's willing to work them. It's not that there's not the population. It's not the population that wants to see this as a job. One note that you notice here when you think of this whole area today is notice the prevalence of the Hawaiian palms. Palm clusters like this cluster here, and especially this cluster over here, were always planted by chiefs. So chiefs had control of trees. So you might have one person who actually owns the field. Another person might actually control the trees, not necessarily the same person. You didn't necessarily own the trees on your property. And chiefs would plant trees as memorials for all sorts of purposes. Especially on the Big Island, I'm not sure on Oahu, but on the Big Island, you frequently see trees with bends in them. And those were actually intentionally done, just like you'd see bonsai do that, where you wrap the tree in various materials. I expect this tree here with the kink in it might be an example of that. Again, we don't know now what the symbolism was of that. We know it happened, but I'm not sure about it on Oahu. So there are a lot of these tree grows, but these tree grows almost invariably signified that the area around here was somehow tied to Ari'i, it was tied to chiefs. And in this particular area this was some of Lunalilo's property in Kaka'ako, Waititi. As the area becomes abandoned, it turns into this. This is a much later picture. This is from probably, well, it must be early 20th century. You got power lines here. So I'd say maybe 1920. So what those wet fields you're seeing have now become completely overgrown. Many of the wet fields in Waititi, the lesser so Kaka'ako, because it was more complicated how you got water in Kaka'ako. But in Waititi, some of the wet fields stay in place, become rice fields. So more accurately, rice/ducks. Ducks are raised in large numbers by Chinese who come in and basically take over a lot of the former Dalo fields that have been abandoned. The Chinese who've come over as immigrants in the 1870s see this as an enormous opportunity to basically sort of redo those since already existing into rice, which was in large demand. And so between the rice, and then use the ducks to basically keep the snails and stuff down. So it's a rather elegant system. You also would throw carp in the fields. So you've got fish, you've got the fowl, the ducks, and then you're growing your rice. And so this, Waikiki, or sections of Waikiki stay in that right into the 1920s and 30s. Kaka'ako, basically not. So a lot of this becomes semi-abandoned. They were running a lot of this as pasture for a dairy that was somewhere over this side. You'll see the Ward family mansion was over here in this bundle of trees. But what you see here is basically this is the end of town. So Thomas Square would be right about here somewhere. And this whole area, if you notice, is just open. There's not a lot going on here. The land was probably technically owned by someone, but they weren't doing anything with it. It was too wet to raise sugar or pineapple. And there were too many old field walls. You can see old field walls here. So other than, cattle or maybe sheep, there really wasn't much you could do with this property in sort of the, late 19th, early 20th century of monetizing it. So it just sort of sits there for a period of time. This is the home of the landowners for the majority of this whole area. Most of Kaka'ako ends up in the hands of the Ward family. I think Erasmus, I can't remember what the guy's first name was. Ward was one of the missionary families that comes over here. I believe marries into one of the chiefly families. I don't really remember. I've never looked into it. And it ends up basically acquiring a large part of this particular section of the Ahupua'a of Waititi, which is basically the Malka portion, which is now usually called Upper Makiki, the sides of Punch Bowl, all the way down to the shoreline. So basically a long strip of the Ahupua'a of Waititi, which was a very large Ahupua'a, but nonetheless, he gets this chunk of it. He passes fairly early on. His wife, the widow, sort of ends up running the place and managing it. They run a ranch, they run a dairy, or I'm not really sure it's a ranch. I think it's more like a cattle farm and a dairy. And the area is Makai that we saw, that overgrown section. This is the family mansion. This is incredibly typical of the structures that your elites had here as part of what you might call the plantation period. Notice how they didn't have a plantation sense of sugar or pineapple, but it's nonetheless these large, largely New England grounded families. The architecture is sort of interesting because it's not really what you might call sort of Louisiana American Southern, and it's certainly not New England, which is what you would think, since that's where the family basically is educated. They're born here, they go to Punahou School invariably, and then they get shipped off to the East Coast, Northeast universities for advanced education and come back to Hawaii. That's was, and in fact still is, the pattern for your landed elites here. And if you notice, this would oftentimes be called, for lack of a better term, sort of what's oftentimes called Singapore architecture, what I'd call British, East Asian, South Asian, what you'd see in India, Singapore, even Hong Kong and places like that. It's very efficient. It's very interesting architecture because it's very energy efficient. All of these areas are tropical. You need to keep a location cooled down. And so these large houses were famous for having very large, what they called verandas, basically lanais on all four sides, whose main function was to keep most of your vertical surfaces shaded. So you kept the temperature down on the structure, using a lot of wood working in terms of the very fancy railings and such here. Very frequently, it'd be a widow's peak, as it's called, in the top, because most of these families, to a certain extent, depended on shipping transport. And so there would be almost invariably a telescope up here, and you could see the ships come into harbor. Since ships always flew the flags of the companies they worked for, basically like United Airlines tails. So you would keep track of the ships coming in, since you thought, your ship was coming in on Thursday. You'd have someone up here watching. So when a ship comes in, you can go down to the harbor and then contact them, because you have to remember, you don't have phone services. So here's a very typical elite residence of the late 19th, early 20th century. Notice the grounds, notice the Hawaiian palms. large grounds. This is actually the Blaisdell Center, where they do like the baseball, we do graduations, but sometimes. And so this is the Ward family estate. We're looking Makai, so this would be basically extending from that sort of spaceship shaped structure across what's now King Street would be right about here. And then you're looking basically Makai with some high rise there below it. On the other side of this would be Greenery, and then Thomas Square's on the other side of it. So this was the Ward family home properties. They had a second home in the upper part of Makiki. This was the main family residence. I have no idea what their staff was, but you have to remember when you're looking at all this stuff, this was mowed literally by people with scissors. So there was an enormous number of groundskeepers and such. There would have been a long walkway leading up to the house. This was typical of how your elites lived. You would have seen tons of these in Nuuanu. You still see a few of these in Nuuanu. And this was the way that you made a difference between the folks who were in charge and the folks who worked for them, which would be your immigrant populations, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Norwegians, Okinawans, whatever, would be the people doing the work, and the people consuming it and running it would be your Kama'aina, your Haole elite. Though in most cases, these folks aren't Haole. I believe the wards is typical. Most of these families are actually part Hawaiian because the families marry into the chiefly families. So they're a combination of Hawaiian Ari'i on one hand and Haole on the other, in the sense of the European, largely British American migrants. So this is your elites. The family donates the land to the city and county of Honolulu in the 1930s, 40s. I don't remember. We'll find out. As one to reduce their taxes, and also because the family no longer lives there. I believe all the family, if there's any left, live on. I'm sure there are family left. I'm pretty sure they live mainly in California, but also some in Colorado, and I think some in New England. So this becomes abandoned, and then they give it over. This becomes a Blaisdell Center. By the 1950s, 1960s, Honolulu is completely expanded. Kaimuki comes into play around 1910, Kapahulu, 1930s and early 1940s. So, the city basically expands all the way to basically it was Waialaikahala, which was sort of the end of town. And also expands in the other direction, Nava direction, as it starts to swallow up the plantation communities of Pearl City, IA, etc. And in that context, then what happens is Kaka'ako sort of shifts radically. Kaka'ako was actually originally, once the wards sort of, collapse the economic system and have their dairy stuff going on. What happens is the Makai part of Kaka'ako, which is, wet, tons of mosquitoes and not particularly attractive, becomes a low-end residential and industrial neighborhood tied to the Honolulu Iron Works. A little important for us to understand now that Honolulu Iron Works was probably the main employer outside of the military in the late 19th, early 20th century here. They made all the parts for all the plantations. Anything that was made of steel or iron was pretty much made there. And so they were like the big private sector employer here in the islands. And their main production facility, their ironworks, was in what's now where Grosvenor Center is. So it basically at the sort of the Eva end of Kaka'ako as it moves into downtown. And so what happened is lower Kaka'ako, Makai Kaka'ako, becomes the residential sort of area where the workforce that works at the ironworks lives. Now, what you also get is a whole mess of other ancillary small light industrial concerns that are originally tied to the ironworks, people that are doing like car repairs or making this or making window frames out of metal or whatever. All of those industries will be there because they're using the ironworks materials, or they're using their workforce, or they're somehow tied into them. And what you're also going to get is little, like bento shops and stuff like that, which you still see a few of in Kaka'ako, are all basically sort of, like satellites around this central, economic hub that's the ironworks. And so Kaka'ako becomes a, sort of, relatively speaking, a poor industrial, urban neighborhood that's got mixed residential industrial that the city and the county and the territory aren't really that interested in. Well, because they've got their large suburban communities like Nuuanu, Manoa, Palolo, Kaimuki, etc., coming up that are almost entirely residential. And so Kaka'ako sort of falls off the charts. Now, I guess this is exacerbated because by the 1950s, 1960s, the ironworks goes out of business. Their main source of business had always been the plantations. As the plantations collapsed post-World War II, the ironworks collapse along with them and goes out of business. And so all of a sudden at that point, you no longer have this major economic hub, which means all those jobs are gone, which means all those folks now no longer have a living. So what happens is your light industrial population sort of starts to disperse out. The light industrial stays because it's really convenient to East Honolulu. What this then gets, though, is replaced by the original Dillingham development of what becomes called Ala Moana Center. So you get this shift from basically what you might call production-based to basically retail-based situations. And you also get the shift from production-based, which was the ironworks / to the plantation / sugar pineapple, to basically tourism / Waikiki, which is, of course, the main reason for Ala Moana being there. And so in that context, there's these radical changes going on in this part of the island, and in Honolulu in total, but especially in this part of the island, vis-a-vis, people's jobs and where they find work and what type of work it is and how it's seen. Now, in that context, what happens is Kaka'ako starts to become an embarrassment. Kaka'ako is now seen as an ugly part of the town that's right next to Waikiki. And because it's industrial, it's not attractive to tourists, it's not attractive to investors. And so there becomes this enormous pressure, especially from the hotel industry in Waikiki, who want to expand Waikiki, but they can't in the other direction because Kapi'olani Park provides the end, and then you've got Diamond Head. And so there's this theory that what you can do is you can expand Waikiki to downtown. And so that would become the function of Kaka'ako. So by the 1970s, this is enormous pressure to do something, and that's sort of in quotes, with Kaka'ako. And so what happens is in this process, large properties pretty much shrunk down to two landowners, Ward Estate, which is the Ward family, think of the mansion, which is basically the Diamond Head side of Ward Avenue. And then on the Eva side of Ward Avenue is almost entirely Kamehameha schools. So what you see is basically, here's Kaka'ako in view. The ironworks was over here. And so what you had was the ironworks, basically this whole area around here becomes the support community, if you would, for the ironworks, because you can't afford to live over here, this is downtown. And so what happens is by the 1970s, ironworks is gone. You've got all this light industrial along here, which is what you still see, for example, when you're going along Nimitz and Kalihi. That's exactly the same system here. And then you've got, of course, as Ala Moana starts to get built, and of course you've got Waikiki or Waititi right here. And so what happens is becomes enormous pressure from the tourism industry to do something about this ugly, quote, section of town here. And so the lobbying pressure they have, since the actual residential community is only about 300 people living in Kaka'ako by then. Very, very large, if I could look at it even today, very, very large number of small shops and stuff here. But in terms of residents, there's an elementary school still here, and a couple of churches and a bunch of homes. Some of the homes and stuff, if you actually go through here, you can still see part of the old residential system. Anyways, what happens is the lobbyists from the hotel and tourism industry, which basically run the state by the 1970s, pressure especially the state. And what happens is the state condemns all of Kaka'ako. Now, condemnation is something you're supposed to use, governments use for things like highways or public use. So, for example, H1, H2, H3 were all condemned properties, which means basically if you lived, for example, in Kaimuki, as relatives did, on 7th Avenue, when the freeway goes in, the government comes up and says, well, we're taking over this piece of property because we're putting a freeway here, and we'll give you the fair market value for your house, but you don't have any choice. You're giving it to us. So condemnation means that the private landowners don't have any choice, but it's in the public good. Now, it's really hard to spin how they did this with Kaka'ako, but it gives you an idea of how powerful the hotel and the tourism industry was, that they basically condemned this whole section of town and do the same thing to it. They evict all the people who live here. They close down the churches or make them move. They close down the school. There are actually a number of ugly incidents that occur in the 1970s when this all happens. But again, the general attitude, I think, even on the folks here in Honolulu was, well, that's a nice place to get your car fixed, but yeah, it's sort of an eyesore, and those folks should move out of there. And you really want to expand the tourism because that's the gold goose, lays the golden eggs, and it's tons of money. And, that would be a quote better use of the land. So what happens is Kaka'ako gets condemned by the government. They form the HCDA, the Hawaii Community Development Association, as a government agency to basically manage this area and encourage the development they want to see down here, which is basically an expansion of the hotel industry, which included both sides, ironically, if you're given the trouble that Oahu is having right now. And so what you get is this all becomes expanded. So up here, of course, you see the original Ward family home, which was right here. And this whole area was the Ward family property. All of this was Kamehameha School's property, still is. And so what happens is that the original intent is that the taxpayer will pay to have new infrastructure, power, sewage, all the other stuff put into this area. And because the taxpayer is footing the bill for that, is your hotels, your high rises and such will come in here, and because they're new tax base and the tax that the people are moving in, or that the tourists are coming in, that this place will generate a lot of money for the island and for the state of Hawaii. That was the theory. The whole thing turns out to be a total fiasco. The state condemns the property, pours millions and millions of dollars into redeveloping this area, repaving the streets, et cetera, forcing out a lot of the businesses. Some quit, some relocate to Kalihi, whatever. They don't care. The state doesn't care. And at that point, then they say, okay, now it's your chance to move in. Well, so to happen that by the time they do this, that the hotel industry has rethought on the idea of expanding Waikiki, and they decided they don't want to. And so the folks that had demanded this change happen changed their mind. And all those folks that got evicted, there wasn't any need to evict them. The large landowners, Ward, for example, over here, Kamehameha Schools just sort of, which was then Bishop Estate, just sort of goes, well, yeah, we were pushing for this, but now we've rethought our model. They started investing their money on the mainland instead. So that this whole area just sort of comes to a screeching halt. The Ward family is trying to find a way to make more revenue. And so what they do is they actually start putting up a shopping center here. Ward, I think the original one was Ward Warehouses, I remember, right here. And so what happens is that they've shifted their model too. And so the state went and took all this property away from people, spent enormous amounts of taxpayer money buying it, and then basically now can't give away the property when they put the infrastructure in. And that's pretty much where things stopped for a long time. The businesses on year-to-year leases and such over here sort of putter on. The Ward family ends up with success at Ward Warehouse, decides to expand it, brings in a partner to manage the properties, General Growth Properties, who are the world largest shopping mall owner in the United States. I think maybe the largest in the world at the time. So they come in and they recommend that you actually expand the Ward retail district down through here. They also end up purchasing from Dai's. They end up purchasing Ala Moana Center. So at that point now you have the managing partners for this whole retail enclave here. Also an Ala Moana Center over here. And then what you get is finally sort of what you might call a change. The change is based upon the premise initially that you can only have a limited amount of retail because at some point it starts to cannibalize on itself, which is certainly true. And so looking for alternatives, they originally envisioned putting up like 5 or 6 large high rises here. But then what happens when they bring these in front of the city and the state planning is the city and the state planning point out that if you put high rises here and increase the population, basically General Growth Properties and the Ward family, they're going to have to double the size. They're going to have to make Ward Avenue 8 lanes. They're going to have to make these streets into 6 lanes. It's going to cost them, probably in the range of, $500 million to expand the road system to handle the increased car traffic that they're expecting down here. And so the end result is basically GGP tells the Ward family, they just tell them to abandon the idea. They then come up with an alternative. And this is where Ward is really interesting because the whole Ward Kaka'ako thing is really sort of a sea change in terms of the way that you mindset people in high rises. Because you have to remember the American mindset, especially post-World War II, is you have to live in homes, and then those homes have to be like over here. And so what you get is people have to live in single family homes. That becomes the American lifestyle. It wasn't, and certainly still isn't in urban areas, but it becomes the de rigueur American lifestyle demand of choice post World War II with the growth of suburbs. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out how do you turn that real estate into something like this, and you can't. And if you start to expand the population, then basically you're going to have to tear down a lot of these homes and a lot of this area to put in the roads, to put people in the high rises here. And so they come up with a really innovative and very different solution. And that's what we'll look at in the last part of this.